A peace deal for the Middle East, Kemi Badenoch's maiden speech as leader to the Conservative Party, potential problems for Labour with a China crisis and a deputy leadership contest, which seems to be getting a little bit spicy. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast then, with me, Frank McKenna, and of course, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. We must start with the big news of the week, which of course is the peace deal in Gaza. And the hostages, as we speak, have just about been released. Obviously, there are some Palestinians being released as well, we understand, by the Israeli government. And let's hope that it is a peace that will hold. Joe Phillips, what are you making of it? Do you think that this is something that we can hope to be and see as long-term sustainable as a peace deal?
Well, I think we all have to hope. It is a very significant moment, and for whatever we all think and have vocalized about Donald Trump, it is quite clear that his bull in a china shop approach has had some impact on Netanyahu. And the fact that he got the Arab states to be involved, I think, has been hugely significant. There's an awful long way to go yet, and there is a lot of devil missing out of the detail of the 20-point peace plan. But the most significant thing, of course, is that hostages, or the live hostages, are all now released. And as you say, Frank, the Palestinian prisoners will be released later today. What happens now to Gaza? We all saw those pictures of hundreds of thousands of people walking in blistering heat to go back to their ruined homes. And it made me think, for all the rhetoric and the hatred and the vilification of immigration that people talk about so much, the desire for people to go back home is absolutely overwhelming, and even to go back to the rubble of absolutely nothing. And I think it's a moment worth thinking about. And actually, the best thing that the world can do is help the Palestinians rebuild Gaza properly, not in some Riviera complex run by Donald Trump or his cronies, but build it in a place where people can live properly and that they can move towards a democratic and properly functioning Palestinian Authority, not Hamas.
What would you see, Joe, as the main barriers for this peace being sustained? Would it be the re-emergence of Hamas in Gaza? Would it be the right wing of the Israeli government deciding to agitate again? What do you think the big dangers are?
Well, I think both of those things, and also the fact that, it's hugely in Netanyahu's interest to keep the conflict going, because he doesn't have to have an election all the time. The country's at war. If he has an election, then he will go back to face corruption charges and he will go to prison. Who knows? I wouldn't be surprised if Donald Trump doesn't seek a pardon for him, but or something like that. But yes, of course, there's always going to be dangers. There's going to be Hamas factions who want to carry on the war. There's the right wing. And of course, the real elephant in the room for many, many people is the illegal settlements on the West Bank. And they are illegal under international law. And if you're really going to be meaningful about peace in Palestine and a future for the people of Palestine and the state of Palestine, you've got to address that issue. And that will be a very big sticking point for many in the Israeli government.
It was interesting, Jim, wasn't it, that when the peace deal was announced and Netanyahu took to the platform in Tel Aviv, he was actually booed very widely by an awful lot of people who were in that crowd, obviously elated by the news that the war was coming to an end. We hope at least a ceasefire was coming into view. But Netanyahu clearly has not got the support, as we've said for many months now, of the Israeli people. And so that government will be unstable. Tend to agree with what Joe said there, though. He does seem to have a strong relationship with Trump, so you would assume that the President of the United States will be making representations to say Netanyahu is untouchable as far as those corruption charges hanging over him is concerned. But looking at the bigger picture, Jim, how confident are you? How hopeful are you that this peace deal can endure?
I'm on the pessimistic side as to whether this is, I mean, the enormity of what I'm about to say will show you why I'm very pessimistic, that this is the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You know, there will never be violence again. You know, I mean, I don't mean on a small scale, but, you know, possibly on a larger scale. I think it's far too soon to say. There are so many hurdles in the way. I mean, just going through this, first of all, as we understand it, all the live, and far too few, of course, of live hostages have now been returned. There's now the question of the dead hostages, and, you know, to some extent, one wonders whether that's going to be possible to be completed, because some of them may have been buried or lost in the destruction of Gaza, and whether that's going to become a point where Netanyahu is going to say, well, you've not fulfilled your promise. I'm not saying he'd immediately return to war, because I think the pressure's on him massively not to do that. The next thing is this peacekeeping force. And I presume that the Turks and the Egyptians and the Saudis are prepared. They must have to Donald Trump that they are prepared to send in their forces. We shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of this for the Arab countries to be in policing Gaza. And it's a complex issue because there's not just the Hamas. And by the way, I'd be interested in your response to this when I've finished. I heard that as the Israelis withdrew a little bit, 6,000 Hamas fighters occupied that territory. 6,000? So much for the, you know, the wiping out of Hamas. I mean, that's an issue. So there's a peacekeeping force. Then there's this Council of Peace, which the Palestinian Authority don't really want. They running the country, you know, smacking of the sort of imperial era when the you know, European powers used to meddle in the Middle East. Then there's the Arab investment, you know, and I imagine that's going to be reasonably straightforward. But, you know, I think we all think that if the Palestinian people could have jobs and decent homes to live in, they wouldn't be so attracted to terrorism. So that's a really important phase. And then, as you've already hinted, this agreement, this 20-point thing, is pretty silent on the West Bank and the illegal settlements and how that's going to be resolved. So there's all that. My final point is this. There have to be elections next year. And as you said, Frank, it's not looking particularly good for Netanyahu. I mean, he's got all sorts of enemies, people who think he's financially corrupt, although I don't entirely agree with Joe that he's certain to go to prison. I just can't see it myself, as I think I said last week. But, you know, there is the question of how this all happened in the first place. You know, why was Netanyahu distracted? Why was it possible for Hamas to do those awful things 2 years ago? So that's got to be the question. So then we think there might be an election which sees Netanyahu off, and it's difficult to conceive a more right-wing government than the present one. So maybe that would be a glimmer of hope if you've got a slightly more reasonable Israeli government that could see this long process that I've talked about going through.
I think what you've just outlined there, Jim, though, is the difficulties, the challenges, the complexities of any Middle East peace deal, and particularly given what's happened over the last 2 years on both sides, you know, the atrocities that have been suffered, and whether or not people are prepared to put aside the even wider chasm that there is now between those two populations and cultures. I did see the report about Hamas and those 6,000 troops again starting to build capacity on the border. And I think we've said, though, haven't we, over months, you can't kill Hamas. It's an impossible task. There are that many of them. And of course, what Netanyahu and his gang have done over the past 2 years has been the greatest recruiting agent that Hamas have ever had. So, you know, as you say, Jim, that is going to continue to play a part in terms of whether or not they, forgive my alarm there, and our fire alarm going off in the background. If you can hear it, do apologise. It is only a test. Don't have to run off. So all of those things. The other thing that came up as an issue, Joe, was the Palestinians, or at least one Palestinian spokesman that I heard speaking over the weekend, not particularly keen on Tony Blair being involved in this process moving forward.
No, and I, there are a lot of people within the Arab world, and I know Tony Blair has worked very hard to, let's say, improve networks, mainly for his own benefit, I think. That might be unfair, but I mean, to have somebody as a Middle East envoy who went to war, on very dubious grounds is dubious in its own sense. And there is this sense of, actually, hang on a minute. So you're going to have this board with Trump as the chairman, or president or something, and then Tony Blair running it. And that reeks of sort of imperialism, colonialism. And that's where it all went wrong. If, Jim was probably there when the Balfour Declaration was signed in 1948. But,
17.
Sorry, 13. Oh, you were definitely there.
I was born in 48.
That whole...
October the 10th. It was my birthday last week. Thank
you.
Oh,
congratulations.
Happy birthday. But I think we in the West, and America as well, have got a lot to answer for, because we have stood by and watched the illegal settlements. We have stood by and watched and, turned a blind eye to some of the worst atrocities that Israel has carried out, not just during this war. But we've also allowed Hamas to flourish, if you like, in the absence of any effective democratic authority within the state of Palestine. So I think, I can see why people don't want Tony Blair there, but it depends who else they put on the board. I mean, if they put somebody, maybe not King Abdullah from Jordan, but somebody from the Jordanian side, I would say, definitely somebody from the Emirates or the Saudis or somewhere like that, because they are going to have to bankroll this. And one of the most significant things I think about getting the Arab states on board is if they pay for the rebuilding of Palestine, that will keep Donald Trump's greasy little mitts off it. And it will be an Arab country, and they will all have an investment in it. And I think, if you look at the reconstruction of Lebanon after the civil war, which I know we talked about last week, that is an astonishing testament really to brilliant design and architecture, and the willingness of people to put money in to rebuild something that was lovely. Now, if the Arab states will stump up the cash to rebuild Palestine, then that's great. But I think a lot depends on, whether Tony Blair is a mouthpiece for Donald Trump, or whether he is somebody overseeing a very mixed and diverse and sensible board of people.
I assume the other sides of that coin in terms of the investment and where it comes from, Jim, would be to say, if the Americans had skin in the game, then it would be less likely that the Israelis would be prepared to bomb buggery out of it again once it's rebuilt. So I can see arguments from both sides there, really. A partnership, a joint venture between the Arab states and the Americans may give us more of a chance of a sustainable peace, may it not?
Yes, that came into the discussions about Ukraine, if you remember, that Donald Trump invest in the raw materials in Ukraine. Russia would be more reluctant to attack it. But coming back to your point, I think the who owns the properties. I think there'd be quite an entanglement between American companies and Saudi interests. That's going on even as we speak. So I think you have a good point there. One other thing I'd like to raise is in relation to Joe was making some really good suggestions about who could be on this peace council to sort of detoxify the idea that it's sort of imperial Western governments running Gaza. In addition to that, I would say you've got to have Palestinian representatives.
Oh yeah, completely.
Yeah, and that brings me to the point: where are the new leaders of Palestine? There must be, because they're all Palestinian people are highly intelligent. They're doctors and dentists and intellectuals. There's all sorts of, they really prize education, the Palestinian people. But you know, we know that the Palestinian authorities, led by a sort of a geriatric gentleman, and is corrupt and so on. So, but I don't hear any names coming forward. And what I would say was, if there are one or two people who potentially could lead a new state of Palestine, they should be identified and put on this peace council for the transition.
Well, you know, Jim, what we need is today's Hannah Nashwari. Do you remember her?
That's the woman. That's the woman.
She was
yes.
absolutely brilliant.
Yes.
You know, this young, articulate, perfect English woman amongst all those sort of gnarly old blokes. You know, but obviously it didn't work. But she.
Well, what happened to her? Do you know what happened to her?
She's still around. She's a professor. I'm not sure where she's based now, but she's still about.
Yeah.
But that's what we need, and you're absolutely right. But they may emerge now. I mean, there will be Palestinians living abroad who maybe now will say, okay, I can go back, I can help rebuild my country.
Well, we all hope and pray that it is
Absolutely.
a sustainable peace. And the one final point I want to make, and we've mentioned Donald Trump's involvement, of course, in the peace process. And when it was announced that the ceasefire was going to happen, Rubio whispering in his ear, very dramatic, of course, and not at all set up, I'm sure. But then he handled it, didn't he, and managed it with his characteristic graciousness and statesmanlike manner, in then throwing his toys out the pram rather, and saying, why the fuck didn't I get the Nobel Peace Prize? So on one hand, you look at Trump over the weekend last week and think, yeah, he's done a great job in terms of getting peace. I felt that the comparison, by the way, between Biden and Trump in this regard was nonsensical, because by the time that war had kicked off and Israel had started to act as aggressively as it did, Biden's days were already numbered. So the idea that Biden's administration could have had any sort of influence on the Israeli government was for the birds, really. But yeah, let's give credit to Trump. But there he was in all his glory, showing his true worth again, wasn't he, in terms of, as I say, the ungracious way in which he reacted to the announcement around the Nobel Peace Prize. Jim, I don't suppose we should be surprised, but it's just so distasteful, isn't it?
Yes, although in a sense the Nobel Prize Committee played a flanker, really, because they gave it to a woman who's opposing the Venezuelan regime, and of course so is Donald Trump. So it was slightly more nuanced than it would otherwise have been. But I mean, there was far too much speculation that he was a cert to get it. As I said last week, the Nobel Peace Prize people aren't going to be pushed around. Thank God, they're one of the few institutions in the United States could do with more institutions pushing back. But they're not going to be pushed around. Secondly, it is for achievements earlier this year, and you know, as we've discussed, it may be some time before we can assess the achievements. But I have to say, of course, apparently he's addressing the Knesset as we speak, and they've been handing out these sort of almost MAGA hats, these red hats for the Knesset members to wear. You know, he is seen as a hero in the Middle East, and for Hamas even to praise his efforts. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So, you know, in this very narrow circumstances, this completely unconventional, crude way in which Trump approaches things has worked with an equally crude bully in Netanyahu. You know, I think your words are well chosen. He lacks grace. He spoils everything he does with his ego. But nevertheless, in this particular narrow sense, he has achieved something. And we aren't discussing Ukraine this week, but there is some evidence that he's beginning to his next focus will be on that, and will adopt the same approach with another world bully in Vladimir Putin. How that will end, I don't know, because I've just, as a complete diversion, I've just been to see a film called the Dynamite House.
Oh, I saw that, Jim. Wasn't it brilliant?
It is absolutely brilliant. I'm sorry, Frank will get annoyed with this, but it's about, you know, a missile that comes towards the United States. I won't do the spot spoiler, but anyway, you know, it shows a sort of chaotic human reaction that the United States would have to a nuclear attack. So, you know, but the president was a sort of Obama type figure, wasn't he, Joe, who was hesitating over
Idris
pulling the
Elba,
trigger.
Like
I
they haven't got any American actors who could play the
well, yeah, but I mean,
president.
he was a sort of, oh, I don't want to pull the trigger.
No.
But
Well,
but
nobody-
the person who is actually in position to do that now, you wonder how Donald Trump would have reacted in the Bigelow film. I recommend it to everyone, but it's
Yeah.
going straight to Netflix very soon, so you'll be
Yeah,
hard to
very
find
good.
it. Sorry, I'm so sorry, Frank. Forgive me.
Well, thanks to the intervention there from Barry Norman and our film night exclusive and that particular movie. And well, listen, Idris Elba, if he's in the movie, then my wife will be watching it, whatever it's about. I can tell you that for nothing. So let me just draw this conversation to a close then. It's ironic, isn't it, that Donald Trump has been successful in terms of the peace deal in the Middle East thus far, and we hope, as I say, it holds. And then, as you rightly say, Jim, there are conversations and rumours this morning that he's about to send missiles to Ukraine to try to basically force Putin to stop the war there. How ironic, Joe, that the president who was elected solely on the promises that he was making on the domestic agenda, his successes are happening abroad. Domestically, he's facing real challenges and real problems.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what are we, 2 weeks now into the shutdown, and people are beginning to not get paid. Once you stop paying the military, then you've got real problems, having called them fat and useless, if you're Pete Hegseth. And I think, people will really begin to see this shutdown bite. But it's, 'twas ever thus that while people are striding the world stage, I mean, Keir Starmer he's gone from India straight to Egypt. Parliament resumes today after the recess, and his problems haven't gone away, and they won't go away. They might go away on November the 26th if Rachel can find another fiver down the back of the sofa. But it is always the case, and and Macron's there in Egypt, and look what's happening in France. I mean, And you sort of think, I'm sure if you were sitting in Chicago or Oregon looking at masked armed troops on your streets rounding up little louts or whatever they're doing there, you might think, what the hell is Trump doing over there? But, it goes with the territory of being a leader, doesn't it?
It does. And just before we leave foreign affairs and go for a short break, we should mention that the guy who resigned as Prime Minister of France last week is back again. He said au revoir rather than he's now said hello, and he's back trying to form a government. So the situation in France just seems to me to be more chaotic by the week, and I do wonder if Macron is going to be able to survive the next 2 years, because the state of the country now seems to me that it's almost got to the stage of being ungovernable, Jim.
Yeah, but there's a very interesting common challenge for arguably the two, well, Germany, of course, but, the United Kingdom and France, two of the largest countries in Europe. And there's a big challenge for the governance of those two countries and questions for the people of France and Great Britain to answer. How much do you want to pay for your welfare? Because France has got it in spades, very generous welfare payments, retirement and all that sort of stuff. And you can see the agonizing that's going on with our chancellor in this country. The same question is for both. We've become used to a pretty, I mean, I know there's still a lot of poverty, absolutely, but we've become used to a pretty generous welfare system, by the way, whilst we've not been doing our defense budgets. But that has all changed now, and that's the basic challenge, Frank. The French people don't want to answer the question, and I doubt whether the Parliamentary Labour Party wants to answer that question.
And of course, when you look at the French situation, they're not even able to get through an increase in retirement age, are they? I think it's still 63. I think I'm right in saying in France. He tried to increase it to 65.
It's shortly after you start nursery school, isn't it? You can take your pension, I think.
But it's a bit like the debate in this country now over the triple lock and those sort of issues. Once you get yourself into that situation, It's, as always the case, trying to untie yourself from those things that are introduced for the right reasons at the time, but then as things progress, you think, bloody hell, this is just too expensive, but then try taking it away. So,
Yeah.
yes, it's going to be difficult for Macron, I think, to, as I say, continue for the remainder of his term. We will see what happens. Right, we're going to take a short break and then we will return to good old Blighty, where Kemi Badenoch has had an unusually good week, and Labour may be in more trouble, again, relating to foreign affairs. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. On Tuesday, the 4th of November, Downtown in Business, in association with Aston University, will be hosting Changemakers Live Summit. And we've got a host of fantastic speakers for you to listen to, including the Chief Executive of Siemens UK, Carl Ennis, and the Managing Director, Birmingham City Council, Joanne Roney. If you want to join us for Changemakers Live Summit 2025 at Aston University, 4th of November, please visit all the W's downtowninbusiness.com, go to our events page and register your interest. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. And we talked all things international affairs in the first part of this week's episode. So we're now going to turn our attention to domestic matters. And of course, it was the Conservative Party conference in Manchester last week. And Kemi Badenoch made her maiden leadership speech. Many had speculated beforehand that it could be her last Conservative Party conference speech. But on the evidence of that speech and the aftermath and the reviews, she certainly bought herself enough time to get through to the local elections, at least in May. There was talk that she may be challenged as early as November, which is the first time that Conservative MPs can put those dreaded letters of no confidence in for their leader. But I've been reading reports this morning from Conservative Home, which of course is the influential platform that most Tories look to see how the pulse of the Conservative Party is feeling. And it seems, Jim, that Kemi Badenoch has done more than enough to secure her position as leader of the Tory party. Has she done enough to revive their fortunes nationally? That is the big question, of course.
Yes, I think the strategic decision was taken not to be obsessed at this conference last week with reform. And I think they've seen that reform's weakness is in the economic field. And therefore, there was quite an emphasis in Kemi Badenoch's speech about the economy and a whole list of things. I mean, we already knew about coming out of the ECHR and the abandonment of the 2050 net zero targets. But the other things like £46 billion of savings, well, I take all that with a pinch of salt, to be honest. Parties often promise those sort of things. But the stamp duty thing really was a headline grabber. And it's something that it's going to be fascinating to see how Rachel Reeves reacts to that particular thing. So there was I think, a sensible decision to try and concentrate on economics, which traditionally, not recently, of course, but traditionally has been the Conservative Party's strength. That a lot of people always voted for the Conservatives, don't like them very much, but we know they'll look after the economy. That's always been their strength. And there are weaknesses in the reform economic program, such as it is at the moment. And these attacks on reform, saying that they're actually quite sort of left wing in some of the things they want to do with two-child benefit and nationalising industries. So I think from a strategic point of view, it was a good thing to concentrate on the economy. One or two headline grabbing things that people might talk about at the water cooler because they haven't been talking about the Tories for the last 15 months. So yeah, she's done enough for that. I mean, however, we will wait and see whether it tilts the dial in the opinion polls. And if it doesn't, and if there are hundreds more Conservative councillors lose in next May's elections, then the whole issue will revive again. One last thing. I think Mr. Jenrick looked at what had happened to Andy Burnham at the previous week's conference in Liverpool and decided that rocking the boat for the leadership was not a good idea just before or during the conference. So he kept quiet, which helped Kemi get on the front foot on the stage.
I'm not sure about that, Jim. I think
No, I don't
Jenrick
think he-
tried to steal the limelight and
Yeah.
failed. I don't think it was anything to do with the fact that he saw what had happened at Labour's conference. I think he made a right balls up of a speech he'd done 3 or 4 months ago, and it was released on tape by The Guardian, where he'd complained for not seeing a white face in Birmingham for an hour and a half, which was, I would suggest, a fallacy, because I've been to Birmingham many times, and it takes me about 2 minutes before I come across a white face wherever you go in Birmingham. But there you go. A very unfortunate remark that the Tories then had to spend 2 days defending. So he pissed an awful lot of his shadow cabinet colleagues and Tory members off. He then went onto stage on the Monday and tried to steal the limelight from the leader, no question about it. And he failed. It was a poor Alan Partridge-like performance, I felt, from Jenrick. At one point, I thought he was auditioning for the Basil Brush show. He had a bloody judge's wig on his hand, and he's waving it about, saying, "Oh, we're going to start to politically appoint judges." And he was going for all the red meat, Jim. So I don't know where you're coming from saying that he'd learned from Andy Burnham. Andy, by contrast, was very quiet at the Labour conference compared to bloody Jenrick, but there you go.
Before the conference he wasn't, and I also think Jenrick's speech was misinterpreted. To be absolutely fair to him, he was actually sad that there weren't many more white faces, and he was calling for a multicultural.
He said he never seen a white face. Jim, he said he didn't see in an hour and a half of walking around Handsworth. He didn't see a white face. And as the former Tory mayor of the West Midlands said, that is fantasy beyond what anybody could possibly imagine. So if you've got the West Midlands former Conservative mayor criticising a comment that you've made about white faces, and I hasten to add, James, I wonder how long it would take you to see a black face if you went to Robert Jenrick's constituency. It was the language, as always, that let Jenrick down, but he knew what he was doing. He knows what he's saying. He's basically playing into that racist element that we have within this country, and that narrative that is becoming far too easy for people to lean into these days. It's disgraceful. I will not have it defended on this podcast. It was a disgraceful remark. He shouldn't have said it. He pissed off his shadow cabinet colleagues, and thankfully it's probably set his leadership ambitions back significantly. But if you're trying to say to me that that was Jenrick's plan, that he always thought, oh, let's leave the door open for Kemi to come and make her leadership speech, I'm not going to rock the boat this week, then I'm saying to you, James, you're as fantastical in terms of your thinking as Robert Jenrick is in thinking that you go to Birmingham for an hour and a half without seeing a white face. So not going to defend that remark, not having any truck with it, and Andy Street was absolutely right to condemn him. Let's get back to Kemi Badenoch's speech, however, Joe, because I thought, you and I had been big critics of her, she did a really good job.
Yeah, she did. And I absolutely applaud everything you've just said, by the way, Frank. And Robert Jenrick looked as though he'd swallowed a bag of wasps after Kemi Badenoch's speech.
I'd love to have seen his wife's face.
Oh, I bet she was. I should imagine he had a very firm spanking that night for getting himself very wrong. Let's not go there. It's horrible. It's too early in the morning. No, I thought. I mean, Kemi Badenoch is not a. She's not a great performer, but she seemed very in control. The stamp duty was a great surprise. They kept it under wraps, which is astonishing. And I think she came across, and she didn't do what all the others have done, you know, Ed Davey and Keir Starmer. She didn't go on and on and on about reform, which I think showed a degree of confidence. And I think it will have cheered the party faithful, but, let's see how she does at Prime Minister's questions. Let's see, whether or not what she's said and the sort of more sensible voices within the Conservative Party who don't want to out Farage are they going to appeal to the people who are already drifting off to the Liberal Democrats, or drifting off to nowhere? So no, I think she did very well, actually. And, we need the Conservative Party to be strong. We need a good opposition, whoever it is, but we do need the Conservative Party, rather than Reform, to be the main opposition.
Yeah, I think Jim was right in terms of the strategy that they seem to chose. Mel Stride in terms of the, fiscal responsibility, Kemi Badenoch going after Reform, saying, they're just not serious when it comes to their economics. I think the difficulty is going to be when Reform and Labour start to say to the Tories, and again, you referenced this, Jim, well, okay, where are your £47 billion worth of savings coming from then? You're saying our numbers are fantasy. What about yours? And what people are not going to buy into, I don't think, is another round of Tory austerity, which it's, in a sense, Mel Stride is trying to sell to people. So there are going to be some challenges, but I think it at least gives them a narrative, a story to grab hold of. And if they can continue to give that message out consistently and really do go after Reform, and Labour will obviously be going after Farage and so on. It seemed to me what Badenoch was saying was look, the economy is in a mess. We do need to sort it out. Neither of those political parties that you're looking to at the moment, that lot in government, Labour, and this one-man band that is Farage, can do that. There's only the Tories that can bring forward a credible plan. And I think that she may have done more than just by herself until next May, actually, because she seemed to me to be impressing people beyond just that right wing of the Conservative Party. So even people like Andy Street, Michael Heseltine, one or two others, were impressed by her performance on the stage. So I think she's given herself a chance of getting through the next 12 months at least. Listen, we all know a week is a long time in politics. What I would say, though, is that looking at the by-elections that took place on Thursday in various councils, very low turnouts is the caveat to this, but Reform continue to outperform both the mainstream parties, and the Liberal Democrats continue to do okay as well.
Yes, exactly. And I think, funny enough, I'm just looking right now at the local council by-election results, and yes, Reform are doing well. But I mean, just to go back to the point about Kemi Badenoch and Mel Stride and the economy, Nigel Farage is apparently going to make a speech later this month about budget. And they're now rowing back on the promises that they made. So they're going to abandon their 2024 manifesto, and they're going to, so the pressure is on them to come up with stuff that makes the sums work. So I think that's quite good. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, that the Greens, although they seem to have got an awful lot of new members since Zach Polanski took over, they are losing support at by-election level, and a lot of that is going in the direction of the Liberal Democrats. I mean, there was a by-election in Teignmouth in Devon last week, which Reform widely expected to win, and the Liberal Democrats took it, with a huge majority.
Yeah, there was an interesting by-election in my old haunt of West Lancashire on Thursday, where I think what was demonstrated, it was almost anyone but the traditional parties. So the candidate that won was an owl, won West Lancashire. So they're called the Owls, and they beat Reform into second place. So I just think this is a lot of dissatisfaction with the two major parties in local by-elections. I do wonder whether that translates into voters to general election. I do still think that there is a potential for Reform to implode and for the Conservatives to recover. And as I say, I think Kemi Badenoch's speech last week gives them every chance to do that, Jim.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that obviously she's, there was criticism in the summer when there was all this focus by the Conservatives on reform and appearing to try and adopt all their policies, that they were going to really seriously alienate the Liberal Conservatives. If they adopt this economic agenda, then that has a sort of intentional or otherwise unifying factor for the people like Michael Heseltine and Andy Street to sort of say, yes, this is a sort of economic responsibility. These are the policies that we can all unite around. So it stops some of that possibility of one nation Conservatives drifting off to the Liberal Democrats.
It was good to see her going after the economy as the issue rather than culture wars.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
I did fear she was going to start to go on about, trans and culture. And of course, there was that sort of, immigration. There was that sort of narrative weaved in her speech and in other people's contributions through the week, but it didn't play as heavy as it had previously. And it was good to see. So hopefully we will see a revival of the Conservatives. But as we've all said, the proof of the pudding will be in the polls. And at the moment, they're not showing much sign of shifting. And that goes for Labour as well, who we all agreed had a decent conference. And Keir Starmer's speech was equally well received by the party and by the commentators. But his numbers haven't moved, and there appears to potentially be this controversy over China and a collapsed case. And the CPS are blaming the Labour government or ministers or particular personalities within the government for that case against Chinese espionage collapsing. Now, I don't know any of the detail of this other than what I have very briefly read in the Sunday Times yesterday. I know scanned that, to be honest with you. It was a very detailed article and feature in the Sunday Times. But it is reported that the Conservatives are going to go after Labour hard. I'm assuming, though again I don't know this, that Keir Starmer is going to be at Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday. If it's not him, it will be David Lammy, who will not be able to say, well, I know nothing about this, because up until recently, of course, he was Foreign Secretary. How much trouble could Labour be in over this, Joe?
I think most of the public don't give a damn. Because, whilst they might think it's absolutely outrageous, they're busy ordering things made in China from Amazon, or they're tying up their St. George's flags made in China. So I think, the reality is we have got huge business interests with China. The thing that I can't quite get my head around is that this case was prepared under the previous government. The arrests were in 2021. It was prepared for court for trial in 2023. So it would seem to me that if you were, let's say, caught speeding, I know it's highly unlikely, but let's say you were 2 years ago and you don't go to court until tomorrow, what's changed? You were either speeding or you weren't. If the road speed limit had changed in the intervening time, does your conviction get quashed? And this is the bit that I can't quite get my head around. That this whole thing about, in order to prosecute somebody for spying, you have to say they were handing stuff over to an enemy state, not a state that was just a threat or hostile or potentially dangerous, which of course you can do now because there was a previous case which actually lowered the threshold from the old Official Secrets Act. But it does seem to me that, did the DPP get its ducks in a row in order to prosecute this if it was so dependent on a government, whether it was the last one or this one, saying, yeah, China's an enemy state, which I don't even think the previous Conservative government would have said they were an enemy state. They might have said they were hostile, but, we've got, China owns so much infrastructure and other stuff in this country. So I I think it's going to be I think it's going to be a bit like the Chagos Islands, frankly. You know, the Tories started it, Labour's inherited it, now Labour's getting the blame for it. And there are questions, of course, over Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor, and his close links to China. And we know, Peter Kyle came to the downtown event at Westminster a few weeks ago, having just come back from China. So, we know the government wants closer relationships with China. I think the bigger question, frankly, is about the Chinese embassy, which this government appeared to rip up all the genuine objections on security and safety grounds in order for it to go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was going to reference that myself, Joe. That seems to be an issue that will be more legitimate for the Conservatives potentially to complain about, because they did object to that plan for that embassy. I suppose the difficulty any UK government now has, though, Jim, is with a more unstable America, an America that you can't rely on in terms of trade agreements. We've all commented now how quickly Trump can just wake up one morning and decide, I don't like that anymore, so I'm going to bang 25% tariffs on the UK in terms of its steel or services or whatever it might be. The relationship with China is not one that we can just sit back and say, oh, well, if they're not playing fair in terms of the rules, we've got to bite our tongue in many respects, Jim, because it's such an important part now for our economy. As Joe said, they bloody own about 25% of the country as it is.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I want to agree with Joe that in the great scheme of things, most people aren't following this, and I doubt if it will do serious damage to the government, even though there is going to be a hell of a parliamentary row this week, because the Speaker, Doug Hoyle, Lindsay Hoyle, who's increasingly become alienated from the government because they won't come to the Commons under their own steam and make statements on things and announce things outside the Commons. That's been a festering issue for him. And this is the last straw, because these were parliamentary aides in his own Palace of Westminster. I think he takes it personally. There's even been speculation he might take out a private prosecution himself, which seems unlikely. So he's going to encourage the Conservatives in making a parliamentary fuss about this. And, it will be around for a week or two, but I think Joe's absolutely right. It's one of those things that fascinates geeks like me, and it won't ultimately impact on the government, although Andrew Neil has been writing powerful articles saying that this helps to destroy Keir Starmer's integrity on a wider front. But the other thing to say is, we are not the British Empire anymore. We are a second-rank power, and whether it's arms to Saudi Arabia, what our relations were with the South African apartheid regime, and now, as you say, with China, it's a muddy and complicated world that we live in, and we've got to trade. And whether it's trading in arms or trading in goods, we've got to trade with regimes that we don't like, and it will always be subject to criticism by people who are purists. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a person of complete integrity, but you wonder who you end up trading with, and that's the huge dilemma that's being faced here. And Joe's pointed out the huge investment that China's got in our country at the moment, and I think this Chinese embassy issue is really fascinating, because there's little doubt that this enormous building they want to build, not so far from the Tower of London, I think, you just know it'll be bristling with intelligence staff and with gadgets to spy on us. And what do you call them? Challenges and opportunities, I think a government minister said yesterday on the television. And that's our relationship with China.
Yeah, it is going to be difficult. I tend to agree with you both. I don't think it's going to cause the government any long-term damage, but it's another headache that they could do without, I guess. And it forces them away from what they're wanting to focus on. And how many times have we said that the government has been distracted from the stories that it wants to get front and centre? So it doesn't help as far as that's concerned. The other minor distraction, I would suggest, at the moment for the Labour Party and the government is the deputy leadership contest. And seems to me that Lucy Powell will end up as the eventual winner. Don't know what you two guys have been doing in terms of observing how that contest has been run, Jim.
Just that Bridget Phillipson, who clearly feels she's losing this, did an interview on Newsnight with my old friend Victoria Derbyshire last week, where the gloves were really off. Saying that there's no point in Lucy Powell being elected because she'll be hurling rocks at the government. I'm the insider. I can get things done like Angela Rayner did from her position. That's the thing to do. Don't say I can't do two jobs. But the gloves were really off because Bridget Phillipson's always been a very cautious and loyal member of the government up to now. But I think she thinks she's losing this, and her best strategy, which is a risky strategy, is to really open up the differences between her and Lucy Powell. So it's, in one sense, it's as you say, Frank, these issues are not in themselves terminal, but the Labour government could do without the China issue, without a bitter deputy leadership election, other distractions. It all sort of adds up in a way that and running up to the budget, which will be an important event. But this deputy leadership election has really taken off in that respect.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because during conference it was very low key. It appeared that the discussion was going to be between somebody who was offering themselves as a shop steward for the membership and backbench MPs, if I can couch it in those terms, and a campaigner, I guess, and making the case, I think very reasonably, Lucy Powell, that if you've got a portfolio of education, as Bridges has, or any other government portfolio for that matter, then it's difficult to actually focus on campaigning and acting as the shop steward for the backbenchers, which apparently she was doing a reasonably good job of in her previous role as leader of the House. So I'm a bit surprised and disappointed, actually, at Bridget deciding to come out and, as you say, Jim, take the gloves off. Joe, what are you making of it?
Well, I agree with Jim in that, yes, Bridget Phillipson has come out fighting. She's ramped her game up in the last week or so. I mean, yes, you say, well, she's got a big portfolio, but, Angela Rayner had a big portfolio too. And I think, but Lucy Powell was leader of the House. And there is an argument there that, OK, so Angela was deputy leader, but Lucy was the one dealing with the backbenchers and who would go to Angela with problems, I think. I don't know. I mean, I've got friends who are members of the Labour Party and they are torn, absolutely torn. And they've got respect for both women. And they're caught between, is it better to have someone on the inside or someone on the outside? But I don't know. I think it could go either way. Yeah,
I don't think there's much between them. In terms of their politics, then you really couldn't get a bloody cigarette paper between the pair of them. So it's all almost invented, this stuff of splits. And the other thing is, and I think this is where Bridget perhaps let herself down in that interview that you referenced there, Joe, with Victoria Derbyshire. You just can't imagine Lucy Powell throwing rocks at the leadership of the Labour Party because it's not in her nature to do that. She's a very loyal sort of member of the party. But people I've spoken to, exactly the same as you, Joe, they're sort of shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, we like both of them, actually.
Exactly.
It's a pity that we're having to have this contest. So it's a shame that hopefully it doesn't descend into that sort of shit throwing contest that we're used to seeing men taking part in. We expect a bit more from women. We expect them to be a bit more mature in their approach to these things. So hopefully it'll settle down. And the results a couple of weeks off, I think. Ballot papers have now been circulated. So most people will have voted. No point anymore in throwing shit at each other. I hope that doesn't descend into a contest, as I say, up until this point has been fairly well behaved. So we will draw this week's politics podcast in the Downtown Den to a close. It's been great to have your company again, guys. We are, I've promised this for weeks now, trying to arrange a time with our man from across the pond, Martin Littross. I'm not sure whether he's been detained by ICE, whether he's overexcited by Everton's good start to the new season, or if there is something else happening in Florida. But I promise you, we are doing our best to get Martin in a podcast to talk all things Donald Trump and what's going on with the orange one domestically. But in the meantime, it's been great to have your company again in the den, and we will be back again in 7 days' time, talking all things politics. Thanks for listening. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye.